Hello and welcome to Series 6 of the Lawyers Coach podcast. My name is Oliver Hansard and each episode will feature either myself or Claire Rayson, both of us coaches and former lawyers, trying to find out what makes lawyers tick. In this series, we will be hearing from guests and experts to help us get under the skin of various cultures across the legal industry. And at the end of each episode, we will both be reflecting on what our guests have said. The Lawyers Coach podcast is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. In this episode, Claire is speaking to Chris Parsons, who's chairman of the India practice and Mental Wellbeing Champion at Herbert Smith Freehills. Chris and Claire talk about Chris's mental health journey through his legal career.
Chris, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
We're going to start this conversation with the question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, what made you become a lawyer?
I guess in some ways it wasn't an obvious choice for me. Nobody on my mum or my dad's side had been to university as far as I was aware. And so I was into sort of new territory. And I guess probably consistent with going to university, I wanted to do something that I'd heard about, that it was that there was probably some sort of maybe some status around it, some sense that it was a respectable profession. I recall I was probably about 14 when I got it into my head that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I think I also thought that it was a sort of balance between the arts and the sciences in terms of structure and approach and those sorts of things. But I think if I'm also completely candid, there would have been a piece around probably trying to impress my dad, because I had a difficult relationship with him. And so there would have been that reason as well.
You mentioned your dad there, and I know, I've heard you speak about mental health, and I know you've mentioned your dad in that context. So what I might do is use that as a segue into your role now, because you are a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, and you have a role there which is Mental Health Champion. And I know you're also on the board of a mental health research charity. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why you also wear those hats.
It was clear to me pretty early on that I found aspects of living, not just the job, but aspects of living difficult and challenging. And I was super anxious, although I was pretty good at hiding it, I suspect, like a lot of people. In addition, as you may have heard, Claire, I would self-medicate with alcohol as well. So I managed to try and calm my anxiety and keep a lid on my stress through drinking each evening. And so in the end, I couldn't control my ability to the choice around drinking. And then, of course, once I did start drinking in that classic way, I would drink too much. So there was a piece around the use of alcohol. There was a piece around working incredibly hard to try and keep on top of things, because those, I think, with high levels of anxiety and those that feel stress, one of the ways in which you trying to manage it is through working very hard, because you're trying to keep a control on a situation that you're finding difficult. Maybe having a stressful job added to the challenges that I was facing, but I suspect that almost whatever I'd done, I would have ended up with some difficulties. I've learned through my role on the board of MQ Mental Health Research, which, as you've said, is the leading mental health research charity in the UK, that a lot of mental health issues, challenges, etc., start in childhood, and that was certainly true with me. So I had a very challenging relationship with my dad. He struggled, frankly, with being a dad. He loved, adored my mum, and did until the day he died a few years ago. But he struggled with children, and in particular, I think he struggled with children because he saw children, and in particular me being the oldest boy, coming between him and my mum. So the emotional energy that she would have shown towards me and my sisters would have been emotional energy that was not directed towards him. So I think he struggled with jealousy. So the long and the short of it is that I guess I grew up with a slightly odd worldview, which was that the world was a difficult, challenging place, and that led to very, very high levels of anxiety, which I took, to university and to my job, and that meant actually I managed to get through to partnership just about. And when I say just about, I mean, I obviously had the skills necessary to make partner at the firm. But it was really, I was sort of hanging on by my fingertips in terms of the way that I felt day to day. And I sort of sensed it wasn't manageable. I sensed it wasn't sustainable. But of course, I didn't have the courage at that stage in the mid-1990s to say or do anything about it. Nobody talked about mental health issues. And I guess I just hoped, I prayed that it would just go away and that one day I would feel all right. And of course, I didn't feel all right, and I collapsed. I was very ill. I had, I don't know whether it's politically correct these days to call it a mental breakdown, but certainly if I talk about myself, I suffered a complete mental breakdown. I was very, very ill. I was off work for 3 months, in bed for much of that time, crying and things. And then there was, even though I got back to work, it felt like things had changed. And I've sometimes described it a little bit like I would imagine being a boxer who'd had one too many fights, and that and so that the blows that came subsequently, even if they weren't as severe, they impacted me to a greater extent than perhaps they would have done had I been in a far more robust position. And so I know how terrible mental health challenges are. I know that they are completely debilitating. I know that they're life-threatening. I certainly, there were times in my life when I wanted to go to sleep and not wake up. And so when I finally was broken enough and had been in the gutter once too often, maybe physically as well as metaphorically, I decided to go public with my challenges, and which is, I think, one of the best things I ever did. And it meant that I could, maybe for the first time, to a wider group of people, be really honest about the challenges that I'd gone through, which was helpful to me. It was a relief, and I also realized from the messages that I received from people, either directly or through email or through LinkedIn or whatever it was, that it seemed to strike a chord, and many people were encouraged by what I was saying, because they were saying, look, you've described how I was feeling and the challenges that I'm going through. And the more people speak about it, the more the stigma will be reduced. The more the stigma will be reduced, the more people are likely to talk about it. So that's really a very, very long answer for why I am deeply passionate about helping people with mental health issues within the law and more broadly.
And I want to, with so many questions going around in my head, but pause a little bit on the last thing you mentioned around stigma. And you've mentioned kind of hiding it, and I know that again, I've heard you speak before where you speak about covering up, and you mentioned as well there a little bit about kind of perhaps the culture's changed, and in the 90s it wasn't something that perhaps you would have spoken about. Do you think if you were an associate at a firm, be that Herbert Smith or elsewhere, you would still feel that need to cover up and that need to hide? Or do you think that things have changed such that actually it is something that's spoken about more openly?
So when I first told my story, the response that I got was mostly very positive, as I mentioned. But there were some, both within the firm and outside the firm, who said, Chris, look, it's all right for you because you've been a partner for a long time, you've earned the trust of the firm, you carry a lot of goodwill with you, and therefore the firm was willing to make some very significant adjustments that they may not have been willing to have made in relation to somebody either more junior or who'd been with the firm less often. And I have to say, I really struggled with knowing how best to respond to that, because I didn't really know whether what they were saying actually was right. And so I'll say two things since that time. One is that the culture that we've been able to develop in London and a number of our other offices is such that I now have evidence that others are willing to stand up and ask for help. So there have been people in business services, there have been associates, there have been trainees who've been willing to share their stories in the same way that I did. And so for the first time, I was able to say, actually, the culture has changed sufficiently for some others, and of course you don't know those people who remain silent. And I've got some partner friends who are not yet willing to share their stories, despite some encouragement from me, and I'm sure that would then be true of associates. I would also say that I'm aware that there have been a number of people who've come through the firm who are now partners who had a history of mental health challenges, in particular around depression, which was known within the firm and have been made partners. So I think I can say with confidence that there's strong evidence that there has been significant culture change. But I would be the first to accept that different firms are at different stages of that journey. Different offices within firms are at different stages of that journey, and different teams and groups are at different stages.
As you know, I've been doing some research. I've tracked the intake that I started life with at Herbert Smith 20 years ago, and the statistics for me were quite shocking. I started life as, in an intake which was 57% female at a time when diversity was certainly something that was discussed. I remember talking to corporate partners about how can we attract more women, how can we get more female partners in. Fast forward 20 years and only 23% of my intake female had hit the highest level in law, so either partner or GC, versus 60% of the men. And that for me was a really shocking statistic. And I started off looking at the issue of diversity, but actually there was a lot of spillover into mental health, into burnout, in particular because the group that fared the worst was corporate. And I know you're a corporate partner. I'm qualified into corporate. And I did a lot of research and a lot of digging into what was behind that. And there were two reasons, both linked to culture. So one was this 24/7 culture of, the expectation that you're always on, the expectation that you just drop everything if that's what's required, whether that be a weekend, whether that be you're going to dinner, whether it be a first date, whether it be a theatre, whatever. And also I found, and for me, culture is how we do things, but also who does things. And this idea of what is a partner, what traits do we see in partners? And a lot of those traits, which people didn't identify with themselves, were assertive, competitive. You get the idea. And actually, a lot of those traits, for me, are linked back to this billable hour, which doesn't reward efficiency, which means that those that bring in the most amount of money are those that are rewarded, and which doesn't allow for flexibility, other things to be rewarded. I really welcome your thoughts about this, because for me, it's a conversation that I think lots of people have, perhaps, behind closed doors or, on a one-to-one basis. But what's your view? What does it drive, particularly in the area that I know you're focused on around mental health?
I do think there's an issue around the chargeable hour culture, and to have reward systems based around how many hours that you charge is frankly a recipe. If you were to design a sort of role around a system that would have the likely outcome of a reasonable number of people struggling, I feel like the law firm culture, they've done a really good job. You stick people in, you give them challenging things to do, which I think is good, because we all want to be challenged, and we want a career that continues to be interesting and challenging throughout. But you add into that mix a sort of a requirement, a request, a mandate, whatever it might be for different firms around chargeable hours. And when you build in, as you say, a feared inefficiency into the system, and separately, you build in a notion that the more I'm working, the more I will be rewarded. But perhaps even more important than that, the more I will be valued, and that's not good. And so I have a very, very clear view that exceptional performance, high levels of performance, should not be dependent on the number of chargeable hours that you do. I'm very, very mindful that there are people within the firm who, might be able to undertake a task, much more quickly than somebody else, come up with the right answer much more quickly than somebody else. And yet the ability to do that isn't necessarily directly rewarded, because there's this focus on chargeable hours. And, I know from a client point of view that it's very rare for professions these days to charge by reference to chargeable hours. And I think it would be an enormous and radical change for us to move away from chargeable hours. A life without filling out timesheets, I think, would be, in part, I'm not going to suggest for a moment, the panacea, but I do genuinely think it would be, in some ways, life-changing. I think it would just be such an enormous relief that somebody is there working on, whether it's an M&A transaction, a dispute, a financing, or whatever it is, and their ability to complete that efficiently, effectively, and to be able to say, look, I've done what you've asked, I'm now going to leave and go home, and I'm going to have dinner with my friends, or I'm going to go to the theatre, or I'm going to go for a run. Then how fantastic would that be? And I'll just touch on one other thing, Claire, if I may, and that's the sort of issue around flexibility and things. I remember, and I'm now talking about pre-COVID days, I remember when we did our last staff survey prior to COVID, the thing that people valued more than anything else was the fact that we had adopted some agile working, which enabled people, as long as the partners they were working with were happy with this, to work remotely 1 day a week. And it will be interesting to see how this new culture of much greater flexibility. I mean, we've formally adopted a policy, which I have to say I was not part of the decision-making group, but I'm very supportive of it, which is a 60-40 policy. So we ask that people work within the office 60% of their time, and therefore and then can work wherever 40% of the time. So that's basically 3 days in the office and 2 days remotely. And I think that's incredibly important because, one, we want to maintain the enormous advantages that are perceived around that flexibility, but also want to ensure that the whole question of working together, learning from others, being part of a team, being collegiate, working as a community, all of which are vitally important from a mental health point of view, quite apart from a sort of general learning and progression point of view. It will be really interesting to see how that greater flexibility feeds into the question of gender that you quite rightly pointed out, and just feeds into issues around mental well-being and whether that can be managed better. But the increasing focus on utilization, the fact that the US firms globally are so extraordinarily profitable means that there is a greater focus on profitability, because of course we're all competing for the same talent. And what we all need to be careful of is that people are not electing for a particular role purely based on remuneration. And of course, the US firms in London are paying considerably more than the UK headquartered firms, and of course the UK headquartered firms are equally paying and much more than they were. But therein lies that sort of untalked about, unstated understanding that significant pay requires significant commitment, and that does worry me.
And it's interesting you say that, because I've got a few things going around in my head, and in no particular order. I mean, one of the thoughts that I had was about the agile working, working from home. The statistics that came out through the pandemic were that lawyers were working just as hard as they ever did. It just so happened that they worked through the commute time probably. And actually some thoughts going around in my head about is it easier to hide, particularly if you're feeling burnt out, if you're struggling, is it perhaps easier to hide that because you're at home and people can't see that you're struggling, was something that I was thinking about.
The answer, Claire, is yes, and it's a big worry to me. I feel very strongly about trying to guide people on effective ways of working remotely, because I think it's an odd thing to say, but I think you need to be much more disciplined and use schedules much more than you would in the office, because in the office, you've got sort of natural rhythm of breaks, coffee, people popping in, your commute, that break up the day in what I think that people don't even really register, but are incredibly important things for us as human beings, as people who are working in a stressful environment, or indeed any environment. This fear that partners and others had that people would somehow be more casual, more relaxed, work less hard, it was a fallacy.
So, I mean, I've started kind of mentioning some of the statistics that came out over, 2020, 2021. Law Care, came out with statistics that around 70% of the people that they surveyed had suffered with some their mental health, whether that was diagnosed or just self-diagnosed. Popped up an article in the FT from earlier this year about lawyers being exhausted, and the pact that you get paid lots of money, so what's expected of you is you give your pound of flesh. And the problems around retention that have come from the pandemic were dealt with by let's just increase associate salaries, which itself sends a message, and a message that was noted, I think, by the clients I speak to, I think, horrified by the numbers that were being thrown around. The question I have, and it comes back to kind of where I started with my report, which is, are we treating the symptoms and not the cause? And yes, we can speak on an individual basis to individuals who are perhaps feeling burnt out, or perhaps, having issues with their mental health. We can get them support, but we're not actually looking at, and I appreciate there are different reasons why we become mentally ill. But you mentioned this idea of profitability. It strikes me, and I think M&A is a really good example. I remember when I was a trainee 20 years ago, sitting in a room with many other trainees with boxes all around me, going through numerous contracts at X o'clock in the morning to try and find whichever clause it was we were supposed to be looking for. These days, I imagine that's all done online. There's AI. You don't need however many trainees sat in a room with no windows looking for those clauses. Technology does it for you. I've worked in firms with a BD hat on, and support staff, central services, whatever you call them, do not get remunerated in the same way as lawyers. Yet increasingly, I think clients do want to have a team that comprises different things. So yes, the lawyers, but also technology, because let's face it, there are lots of tasks that technology does better. There are the business developers who understand the market, who understand what the client really wants to achieve. And Ukraine is a good example of where actually a lot of what goes on now isn't, can we legally do something, is actually more complex than that. Should we do this? How can we go about this? What's it going to take for firms to take a step back and say, okay, we've got a model that worked when we set it up. And yes, it's a very profitable model, but actually perhaps there are other drivers that we need to factor in to create a model that doesn't just provide profit, but also works for all of the stakeholders that we need to take into consideration.
I fear that it will take more people getting ill. I fear it will take some more sadness, at its most extreme, with perhaps, people taking their lives and things, where, occasionally firms will genuinely sit up and think, is what we're doing sustainable? Is it right? Is it fair? Because I think part of the danger is if anything, we're going in the other direction. So what is it going to take? I have some vague vision of a firm that actually, and again, I'm talking completely personally, it is a firm that has at its heart a desire to really help and support the people that work within it. And if you do that and get that right, you will have an organization, a firm that will then be able to look after clients in the most effective way. And I also believe you'll have a firm where, particularly if we can get this question of chargeable hours and an ability to charge by reference to, as a management consultant would be, well, look, this is the fee for the job. And so just a firm that just constantly is thinking about how we can make things better within what is a super challenging job and environment. The way I've sort of tried to picture things in my own mind is there's sort of three elements to it. The first element is around culture and awareness. And I think a lot of organizations have done pretty well on reducing the stigma piece. So people are willing to put up their hand and say, I'm struggling. So let's, and they'll need some time off and all the rest of it. So that's the sort of first bit. The third bit of my picture is, look, how do we look after people if they're not well? And so those are the two pieces. You're saying we're sort of doing quite well on those two pieces, but what about the heart of it? And the heart of it is, what changes do firms need to make in order to mean that the bit at the end, which is that people are super struggling and either want to leave or they need to be looked after by psychiatrists, psychologists, medication, and all the rest of it, or there's a need to build a culture in which people can put their hand up and say that I'm really struggling, because you have at its heart an organization that is set up in such a way that you're much less likely to need the final piece, which is looking after people when they're not well. And I think the answer to that is partly a whole series of smaller things. There's no, and maybe some bigger things. So the chargeable hour, I think, is a super, super big thing, and it's often the sort of the elephant in the room that people don't talk about. But I think, that there should be a really, really clear understanding that partners do need the skills to be able to communicate with their teams and form proper relationships with their teams at an individual level. That means that that they and others can call out if somebody's struggling a bit. And there are still far too many people who think somehow that's some job of HR or somebody else's job. And, I'm a lawyer, I don't have time to, be pandering to somebody who's struggling and all the rest of it. So I think, there's a whole series of smaller things that need to take place that build up to an overall picture in which people start feeling that this is a profession that they really genuinely want to be part of. Because you're right, I was thinking about it the other day. I think if a partner at a major law firm from the 1950s, who, let's say, retired in 1955, came to work, I don't think they would think the job had changed so dramatically. And I think we are in the foothills of the use of technology. And of course, technology isn't going to be the panacea, because if you still base everything on utilization and chargeable hours, the technology will take some of that work away, but there will be other stuff which require long hours and all the rest of it. So it needs a really, really radical change. Some really super brave leadership that puts the people really at the heart of the business. And I think everything else will then look after itself. And the reason that is so tough is it's tough because if you're the first, the worry is that somehow that the firm will splinter and die because nobody else is doing that. So it's going to need some really super bold leadership, and maybe done through some new firms, and for it to be seen to work on a smaller basis, and for somebody, I don't know, at Harvard Business School or London Business School to do a case study to say, look, you can achieve much of what you want to, but in a different way and in a different culture with different expectations and different charging structures. And so why doesn't, the Herbert Smith Freehills of this world, or the Freshfields, or the Kirklands, or the Gibson Dunns, etc., think about changing their model to try and address something that is a real, it's very easy, I think, to think of this as some niche problem area. Disability is the biggest issue facing the world today. And the biggest element of disability is mental health challenges, and in particular depression.
I couldn't agree more. I could carry on talking to you all night, but I love the fact that we've ended on brave leadership, and that you've set out a model, of what it could be like, and I agree. I think it is this, who's going to do it first, and I have no doubt that there will be a firm that will move first, and that firm will be attractive, and clients will want to go there. Chris, thank you so much for your time today, and for sharing your story, and for being so open and honest, and thank you. I think that firms need more brave leaders like you.
That's very kind, Claire. So I hope through the work you're doing and bringing a light to bear on some of these real issues, some change can come about.
Claire, what an inspiring conversation that was. I thought that was an absolutely brilliant discussion you had there with Chris.
Thanks, Ollie. I agree, and one that I think left me feeling hopeful.
Absolutely. If anything comes from it, it's those who are having challenges in the workplace. They can use use Chris's story to help them both get through it and perhaps even seek the help that they need.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things that struck me talking to Chris was that, times have definitely changed from, when you and I started off in the legal profession, when, mental health was something that wasn't really discussed, and, particularly at a partner level, not something that you would necessarily have looked at those in power and thought, they have their own struggles and challenges too. And I think that's what makes it so powerful that Chris is so open in talking about the struggles that he's had. And hopefully that will encourage others to be more open going forward as well.
Absolutely. And to give that hope and belief that one can succeed, regardless of the challenges that one has. He's been a fantastically successful partner and lawyer, and having equal success in championing and talking about the issues that he's experienced, mental health and alcohol issues in there too, which will be widespread in the industry.
And one of the things I picked up on that struck a chord with me was the ability, and clearly because of the level that he's at, he had that ability, but the ability for people to be able to turn around and say, look, this is what I'm good at, and this is what I think I can bring. And it's something that we, particularly when we think about lawyers stepping up to partnership, it's often demonstrating or asking them to demonstrate, this is what we're looking for. Do you tick the boxes? But actually turning it on its head and giving people a blank piece of paper and saying, what is it that you think you can bring? And how does that benefit us, I think is a really powerful discussion that more firms should be embracing and doing more of.
Absolutely. And that to be a proper, diverse law firm, you need people with a whole range of experiences, backgrounds, personalities, situations to really make that law firm work, because you're going to find that in the clients. So if you don't have that range of people and that openness and that empathy with your own people, how can you have that with your clients? Well, thanks very much, Claire.
No problem.
In the next episode, I'll be talking to Trina Ferreter, who's Chief People Officer at Arthur Cox in Dublin. She'll bring both a perspective from across the Irish Sea and a deep dive into what makes a successful culture in the modern law firm. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.
Lawyers Coach is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. If you're enjoying this series, please rate us on your podcast provider so that others can find us. If you're a lawyer and would like to take part in Lawyers Coach, please visit our website lawyercoach.co.uk for further details. And you can also join the conversation on our LinkedIn group Lawyers Coach. If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, then just get in touch.